Welcome, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be sitting down with Michael Meltsner, the Matthews Distinguished University Professor of Law at Northeastern University School of Law. And we're also proud to say the longest serving member of the Board of Directors of the Legal Action Center. Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Paul. And just very quickly, I just have to say what a privilege it has been to have worked with the Legal Action Center all these years.
Wonderful having you on the board for so long. You've been an essential part of the Legal Action Center family for a long time, and we really appreciate your service. And we're also really delighted that you've written a new novel called Mosaic, Who Paid for the Bullet, a novel of the civil rights era. Just showing the breadth of your skills to write a really riveting novel. What led you to write this novel?
Well, that's really the backstory, which is the heart of this. In a funny way, it began when I was in my late 20s and 30s. And that's why I'm able to tell this story, even though I was a small part of what happened back then. It's really a cold case that's come back to haunt me. A prominent and really beloved female doctor who worked in a major southern city in the 1960s is suddenly found dead on her front porch. The bullet that killed her was fired by her own gun. Surprisingly, the medical examiner very, very quickly called this death an accident, but in the city that this occurred, there was a great deal of gossip, and it really exposed something strange was going on. But Dr. Clem, as I call her in Mosaic, was actually a mole. She was secretly telling the inspectors from the federal government how the medical staff was conspiring to keep Black patients and doctors out from the major hospital in this city. And of course, this is the 1960s, the civil rights era. And the law and practice changed. Suddenly, it was illegal to segregate and keep minorities from getting decent health care, which had been permitted by federal law until then. Indeed, most people don't realize, but the American Medical Association excluded Black physicians until 1968. Well, most of the hospitals that were suddenly required to integrate complied. But after there was an effort by the federal government to enforce the law, but 20% of them did not. And the death of Dr. Clem was forgotten until this century, when a healthcare historian unearthed the story. He believed that the death was actually a homicide. And at this point, I got back involved. And the reason I got involved was he called me and he asked me to investigate. Why did he call me? I was, at that time, and still am, as you mentioned, a law professor in Boston at Northeastern University School of Law. Well, it just so happens that I was the lawyer at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the major civil rights organization in the United States, who handled all the healthcare cases in the 1960s. These cases led to the law that the federal government was supposed to enforce. So he said, I believe it was a murder, and could you investigate? Well, it just so happened in one of those serendipitous ways that Northeastern Law School has a cold case project that was created by a charismatic member of the faculty, a former judge and civil rights lawyer named Margaret Burnham, a colleague of mine. And with her help, students went out in the field and tried to discover evidence of what had actually happened to Dr. Clem when she was found dead in the mid 1960s. Well, what they found out was basically that they couldn't find out anything. There were no records from the FBI. There were no records from the local police department, which means that something had disappeared, because there would have to be something in the files of the police department. I had to tell this scholar that we were a dead end, and he'd have to let the matter go. I guess initially I thought I would too, but a few weeks later, I realized that I just couldn't, because I felt I had to tell the story. And the result is, as you see in the movies, this is a story inspired by the actual events. Some of the events in the novel are accurate, most are fictitious. They're the creations of my imagination. I decided that if we couldn't write the kind of report that we would publicize, nonfiction sort of thing, advocacy document, at least I would tell the story. It's a story of the unfinished agenda in healthcare, because as you, especially as the leader of the Legal Action Center, know, disparities in healthcare are still with us. And they become even more serious in an age where we have a pandemic. But this was the beginning of public attention and legal attention on these problems. We may never solve the actual problem of Dr. Clem's death, but the novel is a way, at least, to understand how it might have been.
Well, it's certainly a riveting read, Michael. The backstory is fascinating, and the novel is a lot of fun to read, with lots of twists and turns, which we won't give away. But also, as you've said, really has a hugely important message, perhaps as much now as it ever has, about racism in the healthcare system. So how relevant do you think the work that you spent on this case back in the 60s, and then also the process of during the process of writing the book, how relevant do you think it is to the healthcare problems and the racism in the healthcare system we see today?
Well, it's a signature of how far we have had to come. One of the problems is that litigation can take you just so far. The 60s cases opened things up, led to the Civil Rights Act. In fact, the opinion in the major case, which was called Simpkins v. Moses Cone Hospital in North Carolina, became the text. The opinion in the case by a great judge named Simon Sobolov became the text of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that in turn was the way the enforcement of decent health care through integration began. But conservative Supreme Courts have cut back on the possibility of using laws like Title VI to achieve an end to disparity. So it really requires public involvement and people thinking of healthcare when they go into the voting booth. And so in a way, I hope that a novel is able to reach people on a level that some kind of legal analysis does not.
Well, a question that's of great interest to us at Legal Action Center and other advocacy organizations is, what advice do you have for civil rights attorneys and advocates who are currently fighting racism in the healthcare system from your vast experience?
What has struck me recently is how understanding that litigation is necessary, but not sufficient, and that there are a whole variety of things that civil rights lawyers and public interest lawyers have to do. And one of the great things about the Legal Action Center is while you litigate, you do many, many other forms of advocacy. And I think you just have to keep doing it. one of the characters in the book, I don't think I'm giving anything away, makes her way in the world by understanding really complicated, tricky statutes passed by the Congress that probably many of the legislators haven't even read or understood. And one of the things about civil rights lawyers like yourself is you're able to get inside the whale and figure out ways in which the law can be understood to advance things. But in the end, it's a question of sensitizing the larger public. And of course, we know how difficult that is these days. Always has been difficult.
You were hired by the great Thurgood Marshall. And now, we're looking at what's happening with today's Supreme Court. How do you reflect on your experience through the years and where we are today?
Well, I wrote a memoir some years ago. It's actually on my bookcase behind there, called The Making of a Civil Rights Lawyer. And I was very fortunate that the great Pulitzer Prize novelist Jeff Eugenides gave me a little statement in support of the book. And he said something like, Michael Meltsner's life has been one of watching great triumphs and then watching them dissolve. So it certainly is a different era for someone doing our kind of work. In those days, the federal courts acted to protect human rights in a very vigorous way. That's not what we see today. That's why your work is so important, because you have figured out that there are ways around political impasses.
Circling back to Mosaic, as I'm speaking to our longest serving member of the Legal Action Center Board of Directors and the author of this terrific novel, Mosaic, Who Paid for the Bullet, a novel of the Civil Rights era, which I urge everybody listening here to rush out and get. It's a great read, and also very, very important issues that it raises. So Michael, as in your role as a longstanding friend and member of the Board of Directors of Legal Action Center, what would you say about how this book would be interesting to those people who are supporters of Legal Action Center and deeply committed to our mission of fighting for justice and health for our constituencies?
Well, the context is issues that they would identify with, but this is novel. As I said, it's not a legal tome, and I didn't write it for lawyers or law-interested people necessarily. I wrote it because I think it's a great story.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for spending a little time telling us about your terrific new book. Thank you for the tremendous work you've done as a civil rights lawyer and professor all these many years. And as one of your very grateful students also, my great thanks to you for all you have done for Legal Action Center and for justice.
I'm glad you said that about the students, because now I can take credit for you. I can pretend. Thank you so much, Paul.
Great speaking with you, Michael. Thank you.
My pleasure.